The autumn wind swept through the streets of Oakhaven, carrying with it the scent of dry leaves and impending rain, chilling the bones of the few residents walking along Main Street. In the corner of the industrial district, the fluorescent lights of Thorne's Auto Repair hummed with a low electric buzz, the only sign of life in the growing darkness. Elias Thorne, a man of 50 with hands stained by decades of grease and oil, tightened the last bolt on a 1968 Mustang, his breath visible in the cold air of the garage. He was a man of few words, built like a fortress, his presence commanding but quiet, a stillness that unsettled the more boisterous locals of this predominantly white blue-collar town. He wiped his hands on a rag, savoring the mechanical perfection of the engine, unaware that outside his sanctuary, the fragile peace of the town had just been shattered. 3 blocks away, the wailing of sirens pierced the quiet evening, creating a chaotic symphony that made Elias pause and look toward the roll-up door. Blue and red lights reflected off the wet asphalt, painting the siding of his shop in strobing colors, signaling something far worse than a traffic stop or a domestic dispute. Word traveled fast in Oakhaven, faster than the wind. The local hardware store, owned by the elderly and beloved Mr. Henderson, had been robbed, and the old man had been left unconscious, bleeding on his linoleum floor. The town's collective anxiety spiked instantly, transforming from neighborly concern into a hungry, desperate need for someone to blame, a target to absorb their sudden fear and anger. Elias turned off the compressor and began to lock up, his movements methodical and slow, a lifetime of discipline keeping him grounded despite the commotion outside. He stepped out into the night, locking the heavy padlock, when he noticed the patrol car slowing down. As it passed his shop, the deputy inside staring long and hard at him. It was Deputy Miller, a young man who had grown up in the town, his eyes filled with a mixture of suspicion and hostility that had not been there the day before. Elias offered a small, polite nod, a gesture of civility he maintained as armor, but Miller did not return it, instead speeding up and disappearing around the corner. The rejection was subtle, sharp, and familiar, a cold precursor to the storm that was about to descend upon Elias's life. The next morning, the atmosphere in Oakhaven had shifted drastically. The air felt heavier, charged with whispered accusations and sideline glances that lingered too long. Elias walked to the local diner for his usual black coffee, a routine he had kept for 10 years, without incident. But today, the bell above the door rang like an alarm. Conversation stopped abruptly as he entered, the clatter of silverware on porcelain ceasing as heads turned, eyes narrowing in collective judgment. The silence was loud, aggressive, and suffocating, stripping away the illusion of community and revealing the deep-seated fissures of prejudice underneath. The waitress, usually chatty and warm, slammed his coffee cup onto the counter with a trembling hand, spilling a darker liquid onto the pale laminate, avoiding eye contact entirely. "Bad business about Mr. Henderson," a voice croaked from a booth behind him. It was old man Garrett, pointing a finger that shook with age and accusation. "Some say they saw a dark figure running near the auto shops right after it happened," Garrett continued, his voice rising just enough to ensure Elias heard every syllable. Elias took a slow sip of the scalding coffee, his back straight, refusing to acknowledge the bait, though his heart hammered a heavy rhythm against his ribs. He paid for the coffee, leaving a tip despite the cold service, and walked back to his shop, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes boring into his back. The town needed a villain, a monster to explain the violence that had touched their idyllic life, and Elias, with his quiet demeanor and dark skin, fit the silhouette of their fears perfectly. As he approached his garage, he saw it. The spray paint on his pristine white door, jagged red letters spelling out "Leave." It was a visceral violation, a physical manifestation of the psychic assault that had begun in the diner. Yet Elias did not shout or curse. He unlocked the door, found a bucket of solvent and a stiff brush, and began to scrub the hate from the metal, his face impassive, his movements steady and rhythmic. While he scrubbed, the sheriff's cruiser pulled into his lot, tires crunching aggressively on the gravel, signaling that the law was now officially involved. Sheriff Brody, a man who prided himself on keeping the town traditional, stepped out, adjusting his belt, his posture suggesting he already had the answers he wanted. "We need to ask you some questions about your whereabouts last night, Elias," Brody said, not as a request but as a command. Elias stood up, the solvent dripping from his brush like blood, and looked the sheriff in the eye, his expression unreadable, but his dignity intact. "I was here, Sheriff, working on the Mustang until 9. Then I went home," Elias stated clearly, his voice deep and steady, offering the truth without adornment. "Can anyone verify that?" Brody asked, stepping closer, invading Elias's personal space, testing the mechanic's resolve. "The car is verified. My work speaks for itself." "But no, I was alone," Elias replied, knowing instantly that in the court of public opinion, solitude was synonymous with guilt. Brody chewed on his toothpick, looking around the shop with a sneer of distaste, treating the well-organized tools and clean floor as evidence of a criminal mind's precision. "We're gonna need to look around, Elias. Just a formality, you understand," Brody lied, his hand resting on his holster. Elias stepped aside, allowing the intrusion, knowing that resistance would only be painted as aggression, feeding the narrative they were desperate to write. As the deputies tossed his office, overturning papers and disrespecting his livelihood, Elias observed them with the analytical eye of a mechanic, looking for the flaws in their machine. He realized then that they weren't looking for evidence to find the truth. They were looking for anything to confirm their bias, to close the case quickly and restore the town's comfort. They left an hour later, having found nothing but oil receipts and car parts, but the damage was done. The police presence alone had validated the town's suspicions. Elias stood in the middle of his disordered shop, the silence returning. But now it was a lonely, dangerous silence. He knew that if he didn't find the real culprit, the town would eventually manufacture the evidence they needed to destroy him. He looked at the tire tracks the sheriff's car had left in the gravel, and then he noticed something else. Faint, older tracks near the back of the lot, tracks that didn't belong to any customer. His mind shifted gears from defense to analysis. The mechanic in him woke up, realizing that every machine and every crime leaves a distinctive mark. He walked to the back of the lot, crouching down to inspect the mud, his eyes scanning the earth like reading a blueprint. The tracks were uneven, implying a misalignment in the vehicle's suspension, a specific mechanical defect he recognized instantly. The game had changed. They saw him as a scapegoat, but he was a technician who understood how things worked and how things broke. Elias stood up, wiping the mud from his fingers, a cold resolve settling in his chest. He would not run, and he would not hide. He would take apart this crime piece by piece until the engine of their lies seized up. The hunt for the truth had begun, and Elias Thorne was the only one actually looking. The isolation intensified over the next few days, transforming Oakhaven from a home into a prison where every interaction was a skirmish. Suppliers stopped delivering parts to Elias's shop, citing logistical errors that were thinly veiled excuses to cut ties with the town pariah. Cars that used to line up for his expertise now drove past, their drivers staring straight ahead, unwilling to be associated with the man branded as a violent criminal. Elias worked on the few remaining projects he had, the silence of the empty shop amplified by the ringing of the phone that never came. He felt the economic noose tightening around his neck, a calculated effort by the community to starve him out, to force him to leave or confess. Despite the pressure, Elias maintained his routine with military precision, refusing to give them the satisfaction of seeing him crumble or act out in anger. He woke up early, dressed in his clean work clothes, and walked the same path, keeping his head high even as mothers pulled their children closer when he passed. The psychological warfare was relentless. Whispers followed him like a shadow, distortions of reality where his silence was interpreted as arrogance and his calmness as a sociopathic lack of remorse. At night, he could hear cars slowing down in front of his house, engines revving aggressively, a mechanical intimidation tactic meant to rob him of sleep and peace. But Elias was not idle. While the town consumed itself with rumors, he was dissecting the mechanical fingerprint left at the scene of the crime. He had visited the back alley behind Mr. Henderson's hardware store under the cover of darkness, analyzing the skid marks on the pavement. The vehicle that fled the scene had a distinct leak, transmission fluid, reddish and viscous, and a heavy pull to the right, indicated by the uneven rubber wear on the asphalt. He matched this mental image with the tracks he had found behind his own shop, realizing the culprit had used his lot to turn around, implicating him by proximity. He began to patrol the town in his own battered pickup truck, driving slowly through the residential streets, not looking at people, but looking at their cars. He was searching for a specific profile, a vehicle with a transmission leak, a bad alignment and likely damage to the undercarriage from hitting the curb in a panic. The town saw a predator stalking them. Elias saw a diagnostic puzzle waiting to be solved. His expertise, usually a service to these people, was now his only weapon against them. One rainy afternoon, while buying groceries at the only market that hadn't banned him yet, he ran into Sarah, Mr. Henderson's daughter. She looked exhausted, her eyes red from crying, and when she saw Elias, she recoiled as if burned, her grief instantly hardening into hatred. "How can you show your face here?" she hissed, her voice trembling, drawing the attention of every shopper in the aisle. "I didn't hurt your father, Sarah. I fixed his truck for 20 years. You know me," Elias said softly, his voice a low rumble of empathy that the crowd refused to hear. "I don't know you." "None of us do," she spat back, leaving her cart and storming out, solidifying the town's narrative that Elias was a stranger in their midst, despite his decades of residence. The encounter left a bitter taste in his mouth, a realization that emotional narratives were far more powerful than facts in the minds of the fearful. He abandoned his groceries, walking out to his truck, feeling the crushing weight of being erased from the human race by the people he had served. That evening, the tension escalated. A brick shattered the front window of his shop, shards of glass exploding across the polished concrete floor. Wrapped around the brick was a note, scrawled in erratic handwriting, "Justice is coming." Elias swept up the glass calmly, boarding up the window with plywood he had in storage, the rhythmic sound of his hammer echoing like a gavel in the empty night. He didn't call the police. He knew they would likely file it as a dispute or insinuate he had done it himself for sympathy. Instead, he went back to his investigation, cross-referencing the tire width he had measured with vehicle specifications in his manuals. The tracks belonged to a large SUV or a truck, likely a late-model domestic build, heavily modified with aftermarket tires. This narrowed the list of suspects significantly in a town where he knew almost every vehicle's history. He remembered a specific truck he had refused to work on a month ago because the owner wanted illegal modifications, a lifted black Silverado. The owner was Kyle, the son of the town's mayor, a young man known for his aggression, his entitlement, and his mounting gambling debts. A rumor Elias had overheard in the shop. Kyle was the town's golden boy, a former high school football star whom the community protected and codified, the polar opposite of Elias. The realization hit Elias with the force of a physical blow. The town was protecting the wolf while hunting the sheep. He decided to verify his theory, driving past the mayor's expansive property on the outskirts of town, cutting his headlights as he approached the long driveway. There, parked partially obscured by a luxury sedan, was the black Silverado, sitting awkwardly, listing to one side. Elias parked down the road and approached on foot, moving through the wet grass with the stealth of a man who knows that being seen means being condemned. Up close, the evidence was screaming. A fresh puddle of red transmission fluid stained the concrete driveway, and the front bumper had a scrape consistent with the yellow paint of the hardware store's loading dock bollards. Elias took photos with a small digital camera, his hands steady despite the adrenaline coursing through his veins. He had the proof, but he also knew the danger. He was holding a grenade that could blow up the town's hierarchy. As he retreated back to his truck, a dog barked from the house, and a floodlight snapped on, bathing the yard in blinding white light. Elias froze in the shadows of an oak tree, his heart pounding, watching as the mayor's front door opened. It wasn't the mayor who stepped out, but Kyle, holding a beer, looking agitated and looking straight into the dark. Elias held his breath, a ghost in the night, realizing that exposing this truth wouldn't just free him, it would declare war on the town's very identity. The evidence on Elias's camera was undeniable, but possessing it was not the same as using it effectively in a system rigged against him. He knew that if he went to Sheriff Brody now, the photos might disappear, or the context would be twisted to make Elias look like a stalker planting evidence. The pressure in the town had reached a boiling point. A town hall meeting was scheduled for that evening to address the rise in crime, a thinly veiled rally to demand Elias's arrest. He had to act before the mob mentality solidified into legal action or vigilante violence. Elias spent the morning printing the photos and assembling a technical report, documenting the tire tread matches, the fluid analysis, and the paint transfer dynamics. He treated the crime scene like a catastrophic engine failure, detailing the chain of events with cold, hard logic that allowed for no emotional interpretation. He knew he couldn't just tell them. He had to show them in a way that made denial impossible. He placed the documents in a manila envelope, the weight of his future resting inside the paper folds. The town hall was packed, the humidity in the room rising from the collective breath of hundreds of angry, frightened citizens. The mayor stood at the podium, flanked by Sheriff Brody, delivering a speech about protecting our values and rooting out the darkness. Elias entered the back of the hall, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. The murmuring stopped, replaced by a tense, hostile silence as the crowd parted, creating a wide berth around him as if his touch were contagious. "You have some nerve coming here, Thorne," Sheriff Brody called out from the stage, his hand resting on his belt, his posture aggressive. "This is a meeting for concerned citizens, not suspects." The crowd grumbled in agreement, a low roar of disapproval that threatened to turn into a shout. Elias walked forward, ignoring the jeers, his eyes locked on the mayor, whose face had gone pale, perhaps sensing the shift in the mechanic's demeanor. "I am a citizen," Elias said, his voice projecting clearly without shouting, silencing the room with its depth and gravity. "And I have the concern of a man who is being framed for a crime he didn't commit." He reached the front of the room, stopping just below the stage, placing the manila envelope on the table in front of the town council. "You're looking for a truck with a cracked transmission case and yellow paint on the bumper. A truck that needs money to pay off debts." The mayor stepped forward, sweating visibly. "Get him out of here, Sheriff. He's disturbing the peace." Brody moved to grab Elias, but Elias sidestepped, pulling a printed photo from his jacket pocket and holding it up for the front row to see. It was the photo of the Silverado's bumper with the distinctive yellow paint scuff. "This is your son's truck, Mayor, parked in your driveway." "Taken last night!" A gasp rippled through the front row, the visual evidence hitting them with the immediacy of a physical slap. "That's a lie! You doctored that!" Kyle's voice rang out from the side of the stage. The young man stepped into the light, his face flushed with alcohol and panic. "He's trying to pin it on me because he's guilty," Kyle yelled, but his desperation was too loud, too frantic, compared to Elias's stone-cold calm. Elias turned to look at Kyle, not with anger but with pity. "Show them your hands, Kyle. The transmission fluid, it stains. It doesn't wash off easily." The room went deathly silent. All eyes turned to Kyle, who instinctively clenched his hands into fists, trying to hide them. It was a tell, a subconscious admission of guilt that everyone in the room recognized. The sheriff looked from Elias to Kyle, then to the mayor, the political calculation visible in his eyes. He realized the ship was sinking and he couldn't go down with it. "Let me see your hands, son," Brody said, his voice losing its bravado, replaced by the somber tone of duty. Kyle tried to run, a foolish, panicked dash toward the side exit, but he tripped over a microphone cord, crashing to the floor in a heap of tangled limbs and pathetic sobbing. The illusion of the golden boy shattered instantly, replaced by the reality of a desperate, broken thief. The mayor slumped into his chair, burying his face in his hands as the realization of his son's actions and his own willful blindness crushed him. Elias stood amidst the chaos, the eye of the storm. He didn't gloat. He didn't smile. He looked at the faces of the people who had cursed him, spat on his shop and terrorized his peace. They were frozen, their mouths agape, the prejudice that had fueled their rage now curdling into shame. The enemy had done the job their own protectors refused to do. The sheriff handcuffed Kyle, reading him his rights, the metallic click of the cuffs echoing in the silent hall. Elias picked up his envelope, the rest of the photos still inside. He didn't need them anymore. He turned his back on the stage, on the mayor, and on the sheriff, and began to walk down the center aisle toward the exit. The crowd, which had parted in disgust earlier, now parted in awe and embarrassment. No one spoke. No one dared to stop him. The sound of his heavy boots on the wooden floor was the only sound in the room, a rhythmic testament to his integrity. He walked out into the cool night air, leaving the town to drown in the uncomfortable truth he had forced them to swallow. The days following the revelation at the town hall were defined by a suffocating awkwardness that blanketed Oakhaven like a heavy fog. The arrest of the mayor's son dominated the news, shattering the town's image of moral superiority and exposing the rot at its core. The mayor resigned in disgrace, citing health reasons, but everyone knew it was the crushing weight of public humiliation and private guilt. For Elias, however, the victory was hollow. There was no parade, no celebration, only the quiet resumption of a life that had been violently interrupted. He returned to his shop, removing the plywood from the window and sweeping up the last of the dust. The graffiti on the door was still faintly visible despite his scrubbing, a ghost of the hatred that had been directed at him. He worked on the cars that were slowly starting to return to his lot, but the interactions with customers were painful. Men who had looked at him with murder in their eyes a week ago now looked at their shoes, mumbling thanks, unable to meet his gaze. They handed him cash with trembling fingers, desperate to leave, to escape the physical reminder of their own moral failure. Elias absorbed their shame with a stoic grace, neither accepting nor rejecting their unspoken apologies. He understood that forgiveness was a complex engine. You couldn't just swap out a broken part and expect it to run smoothly immediately. The trust was damaged, perhaps permanently. He noticed that while the overt hostility had vanished, it had been replaced by a distant respect, a cold, fearful respect given to someone who has proven to be stronger than the collective will of the mob. The sheriff came by a few days later, ostensibly to return some items taken during the search, but really to assuage his own conscience. Brody stood in the doorway, hat in hand, looking smaller than Elias had ever seen him. We appreciated your help with the investigation, Mr. Thorne, Brody stammered, the formal title sounding foreign in his mouth. We got the confession. He spent the money on debts, just like you figured. Elias didn't stop working on the alternator he was rebuilding. The facts were there, Sheriff. You just had to look at them, not at me, Elias said, his voice devoid of malice but heavy with truth. Brody flinched, nodding slowly. I suppose you're right. The town owes you an apology. Elias finally looked up, his eyes piercing. The town owes itself the truth. I just want to work in peace. Brody nodded again, unable to bridge the gap, and left, leaving Elias alone with his machines. The psychological toll on Elias began to manifest in the quiet moments. He found himself double-checking the locks at night, waking up at the sound of a passing car, his body remembering the threat even if his mind knew the danger had passed. The experience had scarred him, reinforcing his solitude. He realized that while he was part of the town's economy, he would never truly be part of its heart. He was the mechanic who fixed their cars, but he couldn't fix their souls. Sarah Henderson came to the shop one afternoon. Her father was out of the hospital, recovering slowly. She stood in the office, twisting her hands, tears welling in her eyes, tears of shame this time, not anger. "I said terrible things to you, Elias. I was scared, and I listened to the rumors." "I'm so sorry," she whispered. It was the first genuine apology he had received. Elias wiped his hands on a rag and looked at her. He saw the humanity in her error, the fear that drives decent people to do indecent things. "How is your father, Sarah?" he asked, bypassing the apology to connect on a human level. "He's better. He asked about you. He wants you to fix the truck when you have time," she said, a small smile breaking through her misery. "Tell him I'll be there on Tuesday," Elias replied. It was a small bridge, fragile and tentative, but it was a start. The town was trying to heal, but the dynamic had shifted forever. They knew now that their prejudice had blinded them to justice, and that the man they had villainized was the only one who had acted with honor. The shame was a heavy coat they would have to wear for a long time. Elias sat in his office that evening, looking out at the street. The rain had started again, washing away the dust. He felt a profound fatigue, a weariness of the soul. He had won the battle, but the war against prejudice was a long, silent attrition. He turned off the lights, the darkness no longer feeling like a threat, but like a companion he understood better than the people outside. Winter arrived in Oakhaven, bringing a blanket of snow that covered the scars of the autumn, softening the edges of the town and muffling the sounds of the streets. Elias's shop was warm, the heater rattling in the corner, the air thick with the smell of hot coffee and motor oil. Business had returned to normal. In fact, it was better than before. There was a subconscious drive among the townsfolk to bring their cars to him, a form of penance paid in labor hours and parts markups. Elias accepted this new reality with the same equanimity he had accepted the persecution. He didn't become bitter, nor did he become overly friendly. He became an institution, a man whose integrity was as solid as the iron engine blocks he machined. The whispers in the diner had stopped, replaced by nods of recognition. When he walked down Main Street, people didn't cross to the other side. They stepped aside to let him pass, a gesture of deference. One morning, Mr. Henderson, now walking with a cane, came into the shop. It was the first time he had been out since the attack. The old man looked frail, but his eyes were sharp. He walked up to Elias, who was working under a hoist, and tapped his cane on the concrete. Elias slid out, standing up to face the man whose victimization had started the whole ordeal. "They tell me you're the one who figured it out, Elias," Mr. Henderson said, his voice raspy. "They tell me my own neighbors were ready to string you up, and you still went out and found the rat who did this to me." Elias wiped his brow. "I just followed the tracks, Mr. Henderson. Mechanics don't like things that don't fit." Henderson extended a shaking hand. "You're a good man, Elias Thorne. Better than most. I'm sorry for what they put you through." Elias took the hand, his grip firm and gentle. "It's over now, Mr. Henderson. We move forward." The old man nodded, eyes wet. "Yes, we move forward. But we don't forget." That phrase hung in the air. We don't forget. The town hadn't forgotten, and neither had Elias. The relationship between the man and the town had matured into a realistic coexistence. They knew his value, and they knew their own capacity for error. The innocence of the town was gone, replaced by a more somber, cautious awareness of their own biases. Elias finished his work for the day as the sun began to set, casting long purple shadows across the snow. He locked the shop, checking the heavy padlock. He looked at the spot on the door where the graffiti had been. It was gone, painted over with a fresh coat of white, but under the right light you could still see the faint depression of the scrubbing. It was a permanent reminder that some stains never truly vanish, they are just covered up. He walked to his truck, the cold air biting his face. He wasn't a hero, and he wasn't a victim. He was a survivor. He had exposed the culprit not for their sake, but for the sake of the truth itself, because truth was the only thing that didn't change with the wind of public opinion. He started his engine, the sound strong and rhythmic. As he drove through the town, he passed the sheriff's cruiser, past the mayor's old house, now for sale, and past the diner. He didn't look for approval anymore. He didn't need it. He had his work, his dignity, and the quiet certainty of knowing exactly who he was. The town slept under the snow, peaceful on the surface, but changed underneath, and Elias Thorne drove on, a solitary figure in the winter night, the guardian of a truth that needed no permission to speak, only the courage to be heard.